One of my personal philosophies is that if something is genuinely good, then it will still be good years down the line. It's rarely worth it to indulge in brand new releases because we have no idea if it will actually be good. Even if it gets an initially positive reception, that doesn't necessarily tell us much. Only with time can we determine a game's actual quality and staying power. Even just waiting a year after release can give us a stronger indication of whether the game is an enduring classic or forgettable fad. Consequently, I rarely buy or play games when they're brand new, as there's no real benefit of giving in to FOMO. But there are always exceptions to rules, and I've decided to make one for the remake of Silent Hill 2. Initially, I was hesitant to give money to Konami, given that they are a scummy company that treats their employees and IPs like shit, and every game they've published for the past decade has been mediocre or straight up garbage. But as usual, the general public has the memory and attention span of a goldfish with Alzheimer's, and so of course the remake's sales numbers are through the roof, as Konami's many transgressions have apparently been completely forgotten. It's disappointing, but the small silver lining is that I can buy the remake to do this video without worrying about the ethical concerns of my purchase, because the large numbers of mindless consumers out there means that said concerns don't actually matter from a pragmatic standpoint. In any case, given that it's connected to one of the greatest games of all time, the remake will be talked about for a long time, for better or worse. And since it's Halloween, I figured, what the hell, I might as well compare the original and the remake to see how they stack up. I'll do my best to be as impartial and fair as possible with this comparison, and I think I'm in a good position to be able to do so. While Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, I didn't play it until 2018, almost 2 decades after its initial release. So my fondness for the game is rooted in the game's genuinely high quality rather than nostalgia. As for the remake, I've done my best to stay away from the pre-release press and discussions surrounding it, so I should be able to go in relatively blind. For this comparison, I'll be comparing the remake with the enhanced edition of Silent Hill 2, which I played for the first time this year, as I've had frustrating issues when it comes to older games and getting them to run on modern computers. But fortunately, getting and running the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition is actually super easy, barely an inconvenience. All you have to, hypothetically, do is go to myabandonware.com, find, download, and install Silent Hill 2, then go to the Enhanced Edition's website, download and install the Enhanced Edition, and voila, it's ready to go. I say hypothetically because while what I just described should be legal in a sane world, in the real world it's technically not. Granted, it's illegal in the same sense that jaywalking on a road in the middle of nowhere when no one else is around is illegal. It's against the rules, but it's also extremely unlikely that anyone will notice or care. Even so, I think it's a shame that the original version of Silent Hill 2 is abandonware. But at least Konami's apathy and incompetence works in our favor in this case, as it's hypothetically extremely easy to get the original Silent Hill 2 for free. And Silent Hill 3 for that matter, but for this video we're focusing on Silent Hill 2. As a brief aside, if you've played the remake, I would still recommend playing the original too, because despite their similarities, the two games have distinctly different vibes. And since the original is, hypothetically, free, there's really no good reason not to. Especially since $70 seems a bit steep for the remake, so it's only fair. The Enhanced Edition is definitely the definitive version of Silent Hill 2, as it polishes up the visuals and fixes some of the glitches and issues the original had, improving the experience while still remaining faithful to the original. Playing through it once again confirmed for me that Silent Hill 2 is a great game, but how does the remake compare? It's complicated. There's definitely a lot of areas where the remake missed the boat and is clearly inferior to the original, but there's actually a lot of things that the remake did really well, and I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would. So my feelings on it are rather mixed. Before I begin my comparison, there are a few things worth noting. One is that this video will contain spoilers. I'll try to avoid the big spoiler near the end of the game, as well as a couple other related spoilers, but everything else is fair game, as I have to discuss them for a proper analysis. So if you don't want to be spoiled, I'd recommend pausing this video and playing one or both games first, preferably both. Another thing is that I do appreciate the fact that the remake kind of does its own thing, because while the game follows the same basic structure as the original, the town layout is slightly different and it has completely new levels and puzzles. I think it's a good thing that it has a fresh take on the idea, because if it had had the exact same layouts, puzzles, and moments as the original, it would have felt like Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot remake of Psycho, and there would have truly been no good reason for it to exist. Also, I apologize for the jittery footage. The footage from both versions of Silent Hill 2 in this video are ones I recorded myself, and I don't know if it's the software or my computer or what, but for some reason it looks janky and doesn't fully accurately reflect what the game looks like during my playthroughs. Both games ran quite smoothly, and while there were occasional frame rate drops or stuttering while playing the remake, it didn't happen often enough to really be a problem. Anyways, while I do have a lot of criticisms to go over, I'll be generous and begin by going over the things the remake does right, starting with the areas where the remake actually surpasses the original. As great as the original is, it does have a few flaws, with the most obvious one being the voice acting. I disagree with people who say it's terrible, because it's not, but it's not great either. though it is an improvement over Silent Hill 1. I know fans defend the stilted voice acting and insist that it adds to the surreal atmosphere and sense of creepy unreality, but I still think the game would have been even better if they had hired actual voice actors instead of just grabbing whatever random English-speaking people they could find who happened to be in Japan during development. Like I said, the voice acting isn't terrible, it's just okay. Each person gives a decent performance, and it's just enough to make things work. But it's still not great, and there are times where the line delivery is awkward and distracting. In particular, Eddie's performance is kind of underwhelming. There were several moments that were clearly intended to be creepy and unnerving, and they probably would have been if Eddie had been played by an actual actor, but instead they fell a bit flat, and came across as more goofy than threatening.
Hey James, you know I can get a pizza?
I don't think they have pizza around here, Eddie.
Murder should be legal.
What?
I should just be allowed to kill people.
Why would you even want to do that, Eddie?
Fuck you, James!
Oh, okay!
The atmosphere and narrative are strong enough to more than make up for this flaw, but it is a flaw. But for me, the weakest moment in the game when it comes to the voice acting is unfortunately during one of the most important moments in the narrative. For Laura, they clearly hired an actual kid for her performance, and she does a decent job for most of the game. But there's one moment near the end of the game where Laura is furious with James and screams that she hates him. And it doesn't sound like a kid who's actually angry, it sounds like a kid pretending to be angry. She's clearly trying, but it just doesn't work. It's really distracting, and it takes away from what is an otherwise powerful scene. The voice acting in the remake is definitely a lot better, and the line delivery feels much more natural. The moments with Eddie now come across as more unnerving than goofy, and when Laura screams that she hated James, I believed her this time. There are some problems with the way the characters were portrayed that I'll go over later, but the voice acting is definitely an improvement over the original, so major props for that. Another area the remake improves on is the combat. Now I'm going to be completely honest, I've never had a problem with the combat in the first 3 Silent Hill games, and frankly I think the people who complain about it are being silly. Bear in mind that this is coming from someone who didn't play any of these games until 2018, so it's not nostalgia blindness. Sure, the combat feels a bit stiff, but that's the point. You're supposed to be a normal person who doesn't really know how to fight, and is stuck in an extraordinary and dangerous situation, not Special Agent Leon Kennedy. You can defend yourself, but you don't feel powerful or in control while doing so, which is important in survival or psychological horror. Yes, it is possible to go too far when trying to make the player feel vulnerable and just end up being frustrating, but I think the combat in the first 3 Silent Hill games is fine, it's working as intended, and complaining about it is like complaining that you can't jump as high as Mario in Limbo. You're just fundamentally missing the point. Having said all that, the combat in the remake is better. It's smoother, and I do appreciate that you can change weapons with the press of a button instead of having to go to the inventory menu every time. James is also apparently more athletic in this version, but even so, the combat still doesn't allow you to feel powerful and in control. One big factor that helps is that the game is stingy with supplies. While Silent Hill 1 and 2 were both great horror games with masterful atmosphere, they were a bit too generous with healing items and ammo, and you never really had to worry about running out, which undermines the tension a little. This was an area that Silent Hill 3 improved upon, as it provided just enough items for you to get by, but not enough where you felt secure. And the constant threat of running out of supplies and being caught unprepared kept the tension up and enhanced the unnerving atmosphere. Happily, this is a principle that the remake fully embraces, as it's much more stingy with supplies than the original was. And this keeps you on edge and makes you more cautious. It's survival horror done right, and given that it's a tricky balance, I was impressed at just how well the game handled this aspect of the gameplay. I also liked the puzzles in the remake a lot more. The puzzles in the original Silent Hill 2 are decent, but nothing amazing. They serve a purpose, and some of them are quite clever and have a story behind them or are thematically appropriate. But others are just kind of okay, and a few are pretty lame. By far the worst puzzle is one near the end of the game that involves using a can opener to open a can of light bulbs. Just, what? I understand that they needed a key item to be put with the videotape so that you're guaranteed to pick it up before leaving the basement, but surely there were other ways to have done that instead of this moon logic puzzle. The remake's puzzles are a lot better and much more intricate. I like how toward the end of the game, one of the items you acquire is a can opener, making you think that it might have the same stupid light bulb puzzle from the original, only to have you use the can opener for something else. It's a little cheeky, but as someone who didn't care for that puzzle, I appreciated the nods to it that recognized that it was pretty dumb. As for the other puzzles, the vast majority of them are well designed and clearly had a lot of thought put into them. There were a couple that I did have to look up the answers to, but the vast majority of them I was able to figure out on my own. And I was genuinely impressed by a lot of them. They take inspiration from puzzles from the original Silent Hill 2, as well as inspiration from the other Silent Hill games, and take them to the next level. The apartment coin desk, the otherworld clock, the creepy hospital hand, the otherworld locked box. The weighted scales, the music box in the hotel, all of these and more are real highlights of the game. I was kind of iffy about the jukebox puzzle near the start at first, but I appreciate that solving it requires you to explore the town and actually pay attention. I also appreciated the narrative payoff for the Otherworld locked box, and it was a very subtle but effective way of expressing the game's themes. Not all of the puzzles are amazing, some are more standard, and a few are just essentially the same as ones from the original Silent Hill 2, or one of the other original Silent Hill games, but as far as I can remember, none of them are bad, and the best ones are really amazing. Moving on, there are some things that I don't know if I would necessarily say are better than the original, but are still things that the remake does well. One is the town and level layouts. While the town and levels from the original are still good, I did like the new spin the remake put on them. The town feels familiar, but is still different enough to feel fresh. And I liked how there are more buildings that you can actually go inside and explore. The levels are well put together, and are interconnected enough that backtracking is made much easier. And the game managed to recapture the methodical process of exploring and filling out the map from the old Silent Hill games, while also infusing it with the benefits of modern design. I also think that this is the first non-Team Silent Hill game that really nailed the look and feel of the Otherworld, and I was genuinely impressed by the environment design. Having said that, the Otherworld in the remake feels much more reminiscent of the Otherworld from Silent Hill 1 rather than the one from Silent Hill 2. In fact, in a lot of ways, the remake feels like a blend of Silent Hill 1 and 2. As the overall structure follows the framework established by Silent Hill 2, but there are also a lot of elements that more closely mirror Silent Hill 1. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does give the game a distinctly different vibe from the original, as the Otherworld in the original Silent Hill 2 was more washed out and dreary. But with everything the remake does right, there's also a lot that it gets wrong. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that the original Silent Hill 2 did incredibly well that the remake sadly botched. And most of the important moments are done better in the original and worse in the remake. However, before I start criticizing, I will be fair and go over the moments that I think the remake actually did better than the original. One is the first boss fight with Pyramid Head. While the original is still good, and it is more claustrophobic, in the end you're still just kind of awkwardly running back and forth in the middle of a cramped room. The remake not only does the fight a bit better, but the build up to the fight is really well done. The game includes a stairwell that looks almost identical to the one where you fought Pyramid Head in the original, which will immediately get players familiar with the original on their guard. But when you pass through the stairwell, you don't find anything. You then figure, okay, he'll be there waiting for me when I go back down the stairwell. But nope, he doesn't appear then either, and instead shows up a little bit later. It's a good example of building dread and turning expectations on their head in a compelling way. The actual fight is also pretty good. The room isn't quite as small and claustrophobic as the original, but it's still small, and Pyramid Head seems less sluggish than he did in the original. You have plenty of barriers to put between you and Pyramid Head, but he gradually destroys them one by one, and so you know you have to beat him before they're all gone, which keeps the tension up. And like in the original, ultimately you don't actually defeat him, he just eventually gets bored and leaves, which means that he's still very much a threat, and you dread the next encounter. It was a good moment in the original, but the remake did manage to do it better. I also thought the moment when Pyramid Head chases James and Maria through the hospital basement was done better in the remake. While the original was good, I remember when I first played it, I was taken aback by Pyramid Head's sudden appearance, and my first instinct was to protect Maria by putting myself between them, as I knew she couldn't defend herself. But that ended up just making things awkward, as I stood there ineffectually shooting him, and he just stood there as if to say, hey, can you please move, I'm trying to stab Maria, and you're in the way. Before long, I figured out that we were actually supposed to just run away, but because of the initial confusion, the moment ended up being more awkward than tense. While I wish that the remake had had Pyramid Head show up organically during gameplay instead of during a cutscene, I do appreciate the fact that the remake made it much clearer that you're supposed to run away, not fight. There's also a moment near the end of the chase that actually managed to be more subtle and subdued than the original. And given that subtlety is one of the things the remake really struggles with, I did appreciate that they managed to make the moment quieter and more chilling than the original. Another moment that was better in the remake was the room where your flashlight goes out and suddenly the walls are crawling with bugs and you have to frantically punch in a code to escape the room before the bugs eat you alive. While it was a decently effective moment in the original, the bugs on the walls looked more like a puppet show at a haunted house. And it's one of the few monster designs from the original that I think doesn't really hold up. But in the remake, it really does look like the walls are teeming with bugs, which makes it way scarier and your need to get out of that room all the more urgent. And I did actually panic a bit before remembering what you have to do to get out. By far, one of the best moments in the remake is the confrontation with Eddie. While the scene was narratively and thematically important in the original, the execution was pretty mediocre. And in the end, it does look a bit silly. The remake takes this scene and transforms it. The dialogue is rewritten a bit to sound more natural, and Eddie's rant comes across as genuinely disturbing this time. And this time, James isn't an idiot who provokes Eddie into attacking him, Instead, it's Eddie's own paranoia that does it. The room is much larger and much darker than it was in the original, and the gunfight with Eddie comes across as terrifying instead of silly. It does drag on for a bit too long, but overall it took one of the weakest moments in the original and changed it into something truly chilling. I also thought the boat ride across the lake was better in the remake. It's about the same in both, but I appreciated how the remake already has you pointed in the right direction when you take control, while the original didn't, which created unnecessary confusion. And while I think most of the models and animations from the original are still decent despite their age, this particular bit looks kind of awkward. It doesn't really look like James is paddling, it looks like he's sitting on a boat in the middle of a foggy green screen and is just miming paddling, and it's a little distracting. In the remake, it actually looks like he's paddling across the lake, which was nice. I was also thankful that the game didn't decide to have an underwater monster attack James like when Leon crossed the lake in RE4. Because frankly, after some of the other shit that the remake pulled, that wouldn't have surprised me. But luckily they showed restraint for this moment, which I appreciated. The final moments that I think the remake does better than the original is the section that follows the descent from the service elevator in the hotel. In both versions, you have to use the service elevator to progress further. However, the elevator has a weight limit of 1 person, and won't let you use it unless you drop all of your items in a nearby shelf. And I mean all of them. Your flashlight, your radio, your weapons, your inventory items, your personal items, even the map. All of it has to go into the shelf in order to use the elevator. Naturally, this makes you feel extremely vulnerable once you descend down the elevator. But in the original, this didn't really amount to much, as the only threats you encounter in the lower level are a couple of mannequins that you can easily just run past. In the remake, though, the lower levels are much darker and more dangerous, with several hanging monsters patrolling the hallways and forcing you to constantly duck into nearby rooms. In the original, the loss of your items ends up just being a minor inconvenience, while the remake actually makes you feel the full effect of losing your items, which makes you feel more vulnerable and the area feels scarier and more memorable. Now that we've gotten all of the praise out of the way, let's go over all the areas where the remake falls short. The thing that made the old Silent Hill games work was that they were subtle, understated, and often would use the player's fear of the unknown to allow their imagination to do a lot of the work. Less is more is a key concept that the original Silent Hill games understood, and unfortunately it's a concept that the remake really doesn't quite understand, and it's substantially less subtle, which actively ruins a lot of the good moments and ideas it has. The remake has tons of notes and writings on walls that serve no purpose other than to be ominous. The original had a few of these, but they were incredibly rare, and most of the documents and notes you found had some tangible purpose beyond just being spooky, and would either give you hints about what you needed to do next, or give you interesting tidbits about the town and its history, a lot of which was at least tangentially related to James' journey. They weren't just vague notes that said, "Oh no, he's coming for me," or "turn back now," or other things to that effect. The trouble with these notes is that the sheer number of them means they lose all impact. A cryptic, ominous warning every so often could be unsettling, but when you get so many that you could start papering your wall with them, it just becomes white noise. Bear that in mind, because that's an issue that's going to keep coming up. There's also little details that the remake gets wrong or misses out on. In Silent Hill 3, you can't fall off of high ledges, but the game makes you feel like you could. It's a nice touch that makes things feel more realistic and makes Heather, and thus the player, feel in even more danger. Given the amount of money and detail poured into the remake, you'd think something similar would be implemented when James gets too close to the edge of a high place, especially since the game is clearly drawing inspiration from all of the old Silent Hill games. But nope, that doesn't happen. Instead, the game has details such as James automatically holstering his weapons after a bit and automatically bringing them out when there are monsters around. Not only does this create a disconnect between James and the player, since James is doing things you didn't tell him to do, but it undermines the tension by letting you know when you're in danger instead of letting you find out organically. It's also worth noting that while the flashlight was definitely useful in the original, it was still possible to be able to see what you were doing without the flashlight. In the remake, though, the flashlight is absolutely essential, as without it, some rooms are just too dark to be able to navigate. Now granted, you get the flashlight at the apartments, quite early in the game, but before that you still have to explore the town for a bit, and there are a number of rooms that are just too damn dark. Darkness can be scary, but if all the darkness is doing is making it impossible to see what you're doing, it's not scary, it's just frustrating. And it's especially damning because this was not an issue in the original. Like I said, you get the flashlight pretty early on, so this isn't a major issue, but it still shows that the remake doesn't fully understand the difference between scary darkness and mechanically frustrating darkness. Another thing that feels off about the remake is the camera. Now I'll admit that the camera in the original is not perfect. The controls for it are a little clunky, and occasionally it does make it hard for you to see what you're doing. But for the most part, it does its job fine. And the third-person fixed camera angles were a key component to the atmosphere of the old Silent Hill games. Having the camera be distant and not fully in your control gave the game a sense of detachment, and constantly made the player feel like they were being watched from the shadows by an unseen entity. It added to the creepy and unnerving atmosphere, and was one of the main things that made Silent Hill so effectively unsettling. The remake doesn't do this. It instead goes for a more standard third-person camera that hovers right behind the player at all times. It's not an inherently bad camera angle, but it gives the remake a distinctly different feel from the original. Which is fine. It's okay that the remake wants to do its own thing, but if it was trying to successfully recapture the same vibe as the original, this is a pretty detrimental change. There's also things like the game show announcer and the service elevator alarm. In the original, they sounded pretty normal and mundane, and that actually made them more unsettling given the context. But the remake felt the need to try to make them more scary, which ended up having the opposite effect, as it just looks like the game is trying too hard to be scary instead of just being scary. The original Silent Hill games presented their horror set pieces, and were confident enough to let them speak for themselves, but the remake doesn't seem to have faith in itself, and so just can't help but include a lot of things that are blatantly designed to try to be scary. And when you're trying too hard, subtlety is difficult to pull off because your insecurity makes it more likely for you to overshoot the target and do too much. Hence the sections where you're exploring the town, and then suddenly there's hurricane-level winds blowing through the streets. It's supposed to be intimidating, but it just comes across as ridiculous. It's supposed to be Silent Hill, not Windy Hill. This just misses the point so badly. Another good example of the game utterly failing at subtlety are the many sections with the metal-grated flooring above black pits. These areas were effectively creepy and unnerving in the old Silent Hill games, but the remake ruins them by having bugs crawling all over them, which again feels like the game trying too hard and once again missing the mark by overdoing things. And the remake's lack of subtlety ends up ruining a lot of its good ideas. When you pick up the apartment key, a bunch of monsters show up. This could have been genuinely creepy and unsettling if you picked up the key, examined it, and then when you put it away, the monsters are just suddenly there without ceremony. But instead, as soon as you pick up the key, there's a harsh musical sting and screeches from the monsters that immediately give it away, undermining what could have been a very effective scare. Another example of a good idea being ruined occurs in the Otherworld apartment. You enter a room that looks suspiciously normal, and after exploring it for a bit, you pick up a key item, and the room changes and becomes just as run down and eerie as all the others. Again, this could have been genuinely unsettling if you picked up the item, went to leave the bathroom, and then organically found the room looking completely different from before. But once again, the game ruins it with a harsh musical sting and loud sound effects that give away that something happened. And so the transformed room doesn't have the impact that it could have. And what's so strange about all this is that there are moments when the remake does seem to understand subtlety. It does have some moments that are quiet and subdued and that do effectively capture the spirit of Silent Hill. In particular, there's one section toward the end where you wander through the burned out hotel, and it just lets the environment and atmosphere speak for itself, and the tone is appropriately subdued. If the remake could have had this level of maturity and restraint throughout the entire game, then it might have legitimately been just as good or even better than the original. But sadly, this kind of subtlety and proper pacing is the exception rather than the rule, and there are many areas where the game gets it wrong. Another thing that the old Silent Hill games did incredibly well was sound. While they often had music or ambient noises playing in the background, they knew to keep them restrained and relatively quiet. They also had a lot of moments where there was no music or ambient sounds, just silence, which was crucial to the game's atmosphere and sense of lonely isolation. Loud moments were rare, and when they did happen, they weren't over the top. While most of the sound design in the remake is good, when it comes specifically to the music and ambient sounds in the background, the sound design is absolutely terrible. In the original, each music track and set of ambient sounds was designed for one specific area or one specific moment, and each one fit perfectly. The remake took these tracks and then just played them whenever it felt like it, with a lot of new music and ambience added into different areas as well. This bothered me a little, but what drove me up the wall was that the game would constantly layer multiple soundtracks or ambient sounds on top of each other and play them all at the same time. The result is that the sound design ends up being too loud and obnoxious a lot of the time. And even when it's not too loud, it's still too noisy or energetic, which makes it impossible to create and maintain the quiet and eerie atmosphere of Silent Hill, especially when moments with actual silence are significantly rarer in the remake compared to the original. Another aspect of the sound design that sucks is the monsters, specifically figuring out where they are. In the original, you could almost always tell where the monsters were in relation to you depending on how loud the radio and the sounds of the monsters were. And these sounds would reliably get louder if the monster was getting closer, and would reliably get quieter if the monster was getting further away. But in the remake, this isn't the case at all. Part of the problem is that the cluttered environments and interconnected rooms means that a monster could technically be close by, but there's a wall or obstacle between you and them that prevents you from seeing them and them being able to attack you. But the noises the monsters make and the sounds from the radio do not help you with determining if a monster is actually nearby or not, and the only reliable method is being able to actually see them. About halfway through the game, I just turned the radio off and kept it off for the rest of the game because it wasn't helpful and just added more noise to a game that was already too noisy most of the time. And since I mentioned them, let's go into the problems with the monsters. The monsters of Silent Hill are an important part of their identity. While the monster designs in Silent Hill 1 and 4 are a bit of a mixed bag, the monster designs in Silent Hill 2 and 3 are fantastic. The exact origin of the monsters varies slightly from game to game, but in Silent Hill 2, most of them are born from the psyche of James Sunderland, and are physical manifestations of the many emotions he felt, directly and indirectly, during the years when Mary was dying from a terminal illness. The monsters in the original Silent Hill 2 were great, and served their role in James' journey perfectly. Sadly, the remake didn't fully retain what made them work, and there are 3 ways that the new monsters fall short compared to the originals. Firstly, most of the designs just aren't as good. There was something viscerally grotesque and horrifying about the old designs that made them distinct and memorable, and the new designs don't quite recapture that feeling. They mostly just look like fairly generic horror monsters with some superficial similarities to their predecessors. It's not a huge downgrade, and some like Pyramid Head are still pretty good, but it is a downgrade. Secondly, the monsters are too aggressive. In the original, the only monster that actively wanted James dead was Pyramid Head. All of the other monsters were just kind of there, minding their own business, and the only reason they attack is because you got too close, and if you run away from them, they quickly get bored. It was a subtle but important detail that made the monsters more mysterious, and reinforced the fact that the town itself doesn't actually have any real interest in James. It's his own emotional baggage that's following him around, the town just gives it form. In the remake, a lot of the monsters act like ambush predators that actively want James dead, and while some of them wander around aimlessly like in the original, as soon as they spot James, they will relentlessly chase him down, forcing you to fight them even if you'd prefer to avoid them. Now, while both of those are problems, they pale into insignificance compared to problem number 3. There's too many. Holy fucking shit, there's too many. When it comes to monsters in horror games, you have to find the right balance. You want the monster encounters to be frequent enough that their presence is a constant threat, but not so frequent that the monsters are overexposed. The downtime between monster encounters is just as important as the monster encounters themselves, because the downtime builds tension and dread for the next encounter. This is a balance that the old Silent Hill games handled really well, but it's one that the remake handles incredibly badly. The monsters are relentless and never-ending and just won't leave you alone. There are many sections of the remake where you keep encountering monster after monster after monster, with little to no break in between, and it just ends up being exhausting. The problem is that if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over, you get desensitized to it, and it stops being scary and just starts being annoying. A good horror game will have a player going, "Oh shit," every time they encounter a monster. But if the player's reaction is instead, "Oh for fuck's sake, not again," then you clearly screwed up. Familiarity breeds contempt, and contempt isn't scary, just frustrating. Part of the reason why Pyramid Head is the scariest monster in both versions of Silent Hill 2 is precisely because you didn't actually see him that often. So when you did, it was a big deal. If they had applied a similar principle to the other monsters, they probably would have found a better balance that worked. As it stands, the monsters get used way too often, and it actively ruins a lot of areas and moments that could have been scary, but weren't. That's one of the paradoxes of survival horror. Trying too hard to be scary can actually end up making things less scary. Another paradox with survival horror is that while you do want to threaten the player with death, you also want to avoid actually killing them as much as possible. Because killing them ends up reminding the player that they aren't actually in danger, they're just playing a game. And if you keep killing them over and over and over, any fear or dread they had is quickly going to give way to frustration. During my first playthrough of the original Silent Hill 2, I only died once during the first boss fight with Pyramid Head, but in the remake, I died a lot more, in large part because the monsters were too numerous and had way too much health. And again, dying over and over again isn't scary, it's just frustrating. While the voice acting is better, almost everything else about the characters is a downgrade. In the original, the character designs made them look like real people, with their own distinct physical features. In the remake, they look much more generic and bland, and more like dolls than real people. I think it's the uncanny valley, because while the characters in the remake look more realistic and detailed, I think that's precisely the problem, because they almost look like real people, but not quite. And so it ends up just feeling wrong. Meanwhile, the characters in the original aren't as detailed, but that also means there's room for your brain to fill in the blanks. And it comes off as more natural because it's not so realistic that the small imperfections end up being distracting. While the dialogue is better than the original in a few cases, such as the confrontation with Eddie, those are the exception. Most of the time the dialogue is identical to the original or so close it doesn't matter. But when it deviates, it's almost always for the worse. And a lot of the added dialogue is redundant or just blatantly spelling out things that were merely hinted at in the original, which is yet another failure of the remake when it comes to subtlety. While I still prefer the original character designs for Eddie and Laura, I will admit that overall they were portrayed a little better in the remake. Unfortunately, the rest of the cast doesn't fare so well. James Sunderland in the original is a bit of a doofus, but he's clearly got his heart in the right place. In the remake though, James feels more bland and often comes across as a bit of an asshole, and I found it harder to sympathize with him this time around. Angela is largely the same, but she comes across as more bland in the remake, and her interactions with James are much more polite and boring than they were in the original. While I appreciated what they were trying to do with her extended section in the labyrinth, it doesn't quite work for me because she isn't as interesting and fleshed out as she was in the original. Her lashing out at James was important both to her character and to the uncomfortable atmosphere of the labyrinth, and both suffer with it missing. But the character who is done the dirtiest by the remake is definitely Maria. The whole point of Maria in the original was that she was a part of the game's unsettling nature. She's pretty, but there's still something off about her. She seems like just a normal person, but the fact that she has a similar appearance and name to Mary and happens to be at the spot where James was looking for his wife is a bit suspicious. Her intentions are also unclear, and you're not sure if her teasing is just her trying to be friendly and lighten the mood, or if she's actively toying with James. She was mysterious, and her presence was uncomfortable, in some ways even more uncomfortable than the monsters, because at least you know the monsters are hostile. All of that is gone in the remake. Maria looks too pretty, too cute, frankly too wholesome, and there's really nothing cold or unsettling about her appearance or mannerisms. Her teasing and flirting also seem better intentioned, and it feels like she actually cares about James. She also has a lot more personality, and it's a lot easier to think that her similarities to Mary are just a coincidence. I suppose it's possible that all of this was intentional so that some of the stuff that happens later is more surprising, but I just don't think it works because the story still plays out the same way. James still keeps her at arm's length, but in the original his distance from Maria seemed justified given how suspicious she was, while in the remake it just makes James seem like an asshole. In the end, James, Angela, and Maria have the same basic traits as the originals, but their characters end up feeling watered down and nowhere near as compelling or memorable. Yes, the voice acting is better, but that almost doesn't matter when the writing is worse. Speaking of which, in fairness to the remake, it doesn't ruin the story. Much like the voice acting in the original, it's fine, passable. But there are two major problems with the story. The first is that, in general, the actual content of the story is weaker. I pointed out earlier that there were some moments that were better in the remake, but most of the other moments were slightly weaker than the original, with a few moments being significantly weaker. For example, there was a moment in the game where James is watching a videotape, and without giving too much away, let's just say that in the original what was depicted in the tape came across as an act of desperation, with the overall tone being tragic, while in the remake it came across as an act of malice, with the overall tone being psychotic, which was a huge misstep. And then there's the fact that the final boss in the original was unsettling but restrained, with the final clash being mostly symbolic, while the remake indulged in juvenile over-the-top bullshit that I would have expected from Silent Hill Homecoming or a Resident Evil game. But the biggest problem with the story is the pacing. My playthrough of the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition clocked in at around 6 hours, while my playthrough of the Silent Hill 2 Remake clocked in at around 18 hours. Now some might say that's an unfair comparison since I'm quite familiar with the original Silent Hill 2, and that is a fair point. So let's round the playthrough up to 8 hours, since that's the average time it takes new players to complete it, and I do think that was roughly how long my first playthrough took. But even then, the remake is still about twice as long despite telling essentially the same story. The problem is further highlighted when we consider that, based on my modified playthrough time for the original, the average amount of time between important narrative events in the original was around 11 minutes, with the longest gap still being less than half an hour, while in the remake the average was around 24 minutes. with multiple gaps that were over an hour long, the longest one being almost a full 2 hours. And that's the real problem with the remake's story. It's not the focus. In the original, the levels, puzzles, and combat were all crafted to serve the narrative journey the game had, while in the remake, the narrative journey is stretched out and watered down so that it can add in more levels, more puzzles, and more combat. The original treated the story like the main point, while the remake treated the story like an obligation, one that it kept putting off so it could fling more monsters and puzzles at you at every turn. The narrative journey in the original felt like a well-composed symphony, where every note was in just the right place, and it was only as long as it needed to be, and ended once its story was finished. Every character, every moment, every area had a purpose that served the game both narratively and thematically. While the remake definitely has its moments, looking at them as a whole, the original is the more cohesive and tightly designed experience. Which one is a better game is a matter of debate and personal preference, but when it comes to which one has the better atmosphere and narrative journey, it's still the original hands down. Ultimately, I can see why the remake has gotten a generally positive reception, but I can also see why many fans of the original hate it. It's a good game, but a bad remake. And honestly, the fact that the story is weaker isn't what bothers me the most. It's everything else I talked about. The obnoxiously loud and noisy sound design, the exhausting, never-ending barrage of monsters, the fact that it has a lot of sections that are good but then overstay their welcome. It's possible for a game to have a bad story but still be a good horror game. Silent Hill 1 and 3 prove that. And if all of the above issues were fixed, then it would be a pretty fantastic horror game, potentially even the first non-Team Silent game that actually felt like a real Silent Hill game. So if there are any modders out there with an interest in Silent Hill, this game has a lot of potential if it was polished up a bit. This video is getting a bit long, so I wrote an article on my website about all the changes I'd like to see made to the remake that would take it from being a good horror game to a great horror game, one that I could wholeheartedly recommend. And that's about it. I know I complained a lot in this video, but the thing is, I have a tendency to overanalyze things I like to see how they could have been even better. And despite all its faults, ultimately I do like the remake, and I am glad I played it. Anyways, happy Halloween everyone.